Well, welcome everybody to Manuscript Monday. It's Monday, which first Monday of the month, which means it's time for the Manuscript Society's monthly program. We are delighted to have Howard Margo with us tonight, who's going to talk about John Law, the Mississippi Bubble, and the founding of New Orleans. We're recording the webinar, so you'll be able to watch it over and over and over again, and I'm sure you'll want to do that because we have a YouTube channel, and it'll go on the Manuscript Society website and also on our YouTube channel, and I'll show you exactly how to reach that if you don't know how to reach it already somewhere down the line. Another thing I do want to mention, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm here in northwestern New Jersey with a tornado watch, and the wind's blowing and the lightning's flashing. If you lose us, we will probably be done for the night. I have backup battery and backup generator, but I don't have backup internet. If a tree gets blown down over one of the cables that comes to our office, and we're going to have a little bit of trouble, but I think we're going to be okay. So let me welcome you all and say thanks for joining us. It's going to be a fun night, and we're looking forward to getting it started. So let me tell you a little bit about who sponsors this. These Manuscript Mondays are sponsored by the Manuscript Society. We've been around a long time. One of our part of our mission is to educate the public about manuscripts, historical documents, and history, world history, as well as American history. Why a webinar? Because it's the easiest way to reach the most amount of people in the shortest possible amount of time with the least cost and least expense. So we like these webinars. The Zoom format seems to be working for us. It allows us to be interactive. Why now? Why not? We do them once a month. We look for something interesting. We're looking forward to this program tonight. We've invited the members of the Manuscript Society, all of their friends, Society of American Archivists, the International Society of Appraisers, our friends and neighbors, and anybody interested in history. I hope you've invited your friends as well, because it's open to everybody. There is no cost. It is absolutely free, and we're just going to move along. I'll tell you about what we're going to cover in just a second, and I'm going to tell you how to get more information about our program tonight, about Manuscript Monday, and about the Manuscript Society. I'll let you read this because you can all read. So it's going to be a great program. Howard's put together something spectacular for him. Let me tell you about Howard Margo. He's a native New Orleans, approximately a 10th generation Louisianan. Howard Margo is a curator of the historic New Orleans collection, where he's worked since 2006. Educated in his home state and in France, he's enjoyed working with local French and Spanish manuscripts from his favorite century, the 18th, since all the way back in 2001. We had a little tech check, and I got a chance to chat with Howard. He's a teacher turned historian and archivist, but I guess as a French teacher, you are a bit of a historian, talking about the Romance languages. So we're just great to have him here, and really looking forward to it. So with that, I am going to pop out of this and get rid of sharing my screen, and Howard, make you the host. This is our transition, which always takes a little bit of time, but we're going to get there. So let me make you the host, and you can just take it from here. Make host. So with that, you will be able to share your screen and bring your screen up, and everybody will see what you're up to.
And
so if you're just joining us, our guest is Howard Margo. He's taking over the screen. He's taking over the world, like in the Outer Limits, the old Outer Limits TV show.
now I've got to find slideshow.
Yep, there you go.
From beginning, usually a good place. There we are.
It's a good place to start. That is great. Ladies and gentlemen, Howard Margo.
Thank you, Brian. Hope everyone can hear me. Well, since I don't see a volume control anymore. I just a caveat. I had some dental work done earlier today, and although most of the Novocaine is worn off, I might trip over my tongue a couple of times. I can't promise I won't.
You'll be just fine.
Yeah. So let me just say before I start the talk that the Historic New Orleans Collection, my employer, is a small but growing private museum research center and publisher located obviously in New Orleans. We've been in existence since 1968 and started out as a kind of a small mom and pop operation. But our history is a story in itself. So I would ask any of you who are curious about it to go to our website and check out how we came into existence. But New Orleans is a city that is rich, rich, rich in founding and 19th and 20th century documents. Most of the early documents are in French and Spanish, so you have to be able to read that up till about the Civil War, start getting more and more things in English. I mean, you have English before the Civil War, but it doesn't, French remains pretty dominant until then. And our organization is dedicated to preserving a lot of things that the public institutions never got around to acquiring or can't afford to acquire. Our public institutions here are sort of underfunded top to bottom, and museums and archives are no exceptions. But we do have really spectacular archives in this city, and I'd be happy to let you know more about that if you send me an email later on. So where's the arrow? So let's start our story. Oh, can this thing move? No. I can't see my own title because of the bar. Is there any way to move? Oh, well.
Oh, the bar, your top bar up there?
I got a top bar. Is there any way to move that?
Where it says you're viewing your screen there.
Can you share? Share? Not really. Yeah. Oh well.
Did we have it? Did we have it last time? Can you open?
I thought we did.
Yeah, you working off of one screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's see how we can make this a little bit easier for you. How can I do that? Your other option is to go out of your slideshow mode and just kind of move the slides off to the left, and you should be able to see what you do. So if you end your slideshow, we'll be able to still see your slides. It just won't be in this presentation mode.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop share.
Okay, you're still the host though.
Okay, and then I'm going to have to.
And your slideshow, and then just kind of leave it on the screen where you want it, where you can see, and then we'll reshare your screen.
Well, I'll just. There. Now I can see what I'm doing.
Good, excellent, well done. And we can see that print right there, and you're all set. See the 1682 print.
Good. So this fellow, René Cavalier de la Salle, as people here my age learned in grammar school, paddled and hiked from New France, also known as Canada, down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico in 1682 and claimed the entire river basin for France. But it was not until 16 years after that that France sent the Canadian sea captain and explorer Pierre Le Moyne Sieur d'Iberville to make good on that claim. And another 20 plus years after that, before the colony had a viable permanent capital. So what was up with that? The short answer is that the French were pretty indifferent colonizers compared to their competition. When they got into the game around the year 1600, Spain and Portugal had already been at it for well over a century. The English got their start about the same time as the French, but were usually 2 steps ahead of them, whether in the old world or the new. It didn't help matters much that the French king for most of the 17th century, Louis XIV, spent constantly and lavishly on continental wars, not to mention on things like, building his palace at Versailles. Besides, the French did have one brutally efficient and extremely profitable colony, Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, which at the time produced more of Europe's sugar than any other place. This is an image, a drawing from the mid 18th century, but sure, it looked a lot like that in the mid 17th century. And the colony of Saint-Domingue was France's piggy bank. That's really where a lot of their money came from, because they produced so much sugar at the time. And you see the poor fellow with the weird device around his neck. And then the guy on the left looks like he has a whip. And I don't think they're giving him a birthday party. By the time, and I'm just going to call it d'Iberville, I'm just going to call him Iberville, okay? By the time that Iberville built Fort Maurepas in 1699, which is the current site of Ocean Springs near Biloxi, by that time, 1699, there were over 250,000 people living in the English colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. And by contrast, the French population in all of North America was probably not much above 25 or 30,000, centered in Quebec, of course, but including a small legion of backwoods traders known as coureurs de bois, literally forest runners, who were spread out all over the Great Lakes and upper Mississippi Valley, staying close to and often intermarrying with the Native American peoples with whom they traded for pelts. Pelts from North America were a huge source of income for Europe, nothing compared to the sugar from Haiti, though. Say a word about this Iberville prospectus. When he was given the job of exploring the lower Mississippi Valley and finding the mouth of the Mississippi, which LaSalle was never able to do, he sent this prospectus to the French court, and it's propaganda. It purports to be from him, but it looks like it's not in his hand, but it's in the hand of a professional clerk or secretary, kind of a recognizable style. And in this document, he is telling the French crown that there are gold, silver, tin mines to be exploited in Louisiana. There are natural resources, abundant natural resources. The climate is wonderful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all a lie. A lot of this information can be found in travelers' journals from this period and later. They seem to kind of, circulate them and regurgitate them from one generation to the next. People who had never actually been to the New World, but copied someone else's work. And it really sounds more like a description of Mexico. That is to say, what today is Texas and New Mexico, land west of the Sabine River, more than it sounds like Louisiana. Anyway, back to our story. The forces driving colonization were the same across Europe. Above all, the desire for wealth in the form of exploitable, one might say pilferable natural resources, and its attendant requirement of military force to protect one slice of the pie. The richer you were, the bigger the armies and navies you could buy to protect your home country and to subjugate new lands, which would create more wealth but require more military expenditure, and so on, in a nice little feedback loop. But there were other forces at play in Europe's royal courts, especially the church's desire for converts and the nascent scientific community's desire for discoveries. And these could have an outsized influence on a given monarch at a given time, even when they sometimes interfered with the overarching goals of profit and military superiority. So at least on this one occasion, demonstrating a perfect understanding of geography as a tool of war, what France's Minister of the Navy, Jérôme Philippot, Comte de Pontchartrain, that's Pontchartrain, whom the lake was named for, what the Minister of the Navy wanted desperately was a way to control the mouth of the Mississippi River. There, it was thought by most observers, relatively small garrisons and well-placed forts could hold 10 times their number at bay. too expensive for most military forces of the day to assault them. It could give Quebec a much needed shipping route to the Gulf of Mexico, so they didn't have to go through English blockades in the North Atlantic, and hopefully prevent English expansion westward into the country just long enough for the French to more fully populate the region, well, populate the region at all. The problem with their plan, as Iberville soon discovered, was that the Mississippi had not one mouth but several, which endlessly silted up or ran clear, kind of unpredictably. Most of the floodlands between the Gulf and Lake Pontchartrain, assuming that it even allowed you to sail that far upriver, were not suitable for permanent settlement. It was both a navigator's and a surveyor's nightmare that would take time to overcome, but Iberville had no time to spare. The Spanish were already in Pensacola, and the British were encroaching westward. So while Fort Maurepas in Biloxi was a necessary stopgap for defending the Mississippi, the sandy soil there could not sustain a large settlement. Mobile Bay, on the other hand, offered a sheltered harbor, a base from which to befriend the powerful native tribes of the interior, and so it was thought better soil for agriculture. Iberville convinced the minister of the Navy that he'd better grab it before someone else did. Thus began Mobile's run as the major settlement and first capital of the, or first real capital of the Louisiana colony. This item, there are quite a few maps in my PowerPoint, and most of them do not belong to the Historic New Orleans collection. Most of them belong to French archives, but I didn't think you'd want to see a PowerPoint entirely filled with documents. The maps are nice to look at. And this is the original site of Mobile, which was about 27 miles upriver from the Gulf. And so you can imagine not very easy to reach. In 1706, Iberville sailed to Havana, where he died, possibly of yellow fever. His younger brother and former second in command, Bienville, had become governor of the colony in Mobile 4 years earlier at the ripe old age of 22. At the time of his death, Iberville was, what was he doing in Canada, in Havana? Well, he was heading back to France because he was facing serious charges of corruption and malfeasance, and he was going back to France to defend himself. And unfortunately for Jean-Baptiste, he would be saddled with the same sort of bad reputation for the rest of his career. But Bienville's fledgling Louisiana colony, which was never more than a few hundred soldiers and settlers at the beginning, had to compete with the ruinous War of the Spanish Succession for funding, 1701, 1715. So it's hardly surprising if his rule breaking and cooking of the account books looked like corruption to the well-fed bean counters back in France. Consider what Bienville was up against. French naval officers were so underpaid during this period that some looted the few supply ships bound for Mobile before they arrived. Poverty in the colony was endemic and desertions were common, with soldiers being routinely embedded with friendly tribes in the winter to avoid starvation. And all the while, the numerically superior, far superior English colonies and their native allies were right next door, probing and attacking whenever they could. The conventional wisdom is that whatever you think about Bienville's personality or methods, he was the one that held things together during this period. And he's often referred to as a genius at Indian relations and a genius at frontier tactics. And you'd have to say the proof is in the pudding, because his little colony of a few hundred people survived French and English and Spanish attacks for almost 15 years. Now, why was he so good at Indian relations? Well, he adopted their culture, and he learned several Indian languages. He was a bit of a linguist, and he had himself tattooed because the natives that he was encountering at the time, the warriors did this. They didn't wear fancy clothes too much when they went into battle. They let their tattoos and their scars speak for them. So this is based on a couple of written descriptions from the period. There are no contemporary drawings, But all the two descriptions from different sources agree that he had a snake kind of wrapped around him in some fashion, pointing the way it points, and that there was a lot of Christian iconography mixed in with the pagan iconography. Of course, this was the mere thought of this was appalling to the French and to most Europeans who thought you shouldn't do that to your body at the time. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. Wait, you're thinking, isn't this talk supposed to be about John Law and his infamous Mississippi system? Okay, so let's turn our attention from North America, where Law never set foot, back to Europe. And this is the same drawing that Brian used for the intro, because it's really the only good depiction of Law that we have. Formerly educated in Edinburgh, John Law chose not to follow in his family's goldsmithing and banking business, and he moved to London. There, the tall, handsome, charming social climber leaped is more like it, into the life of a dandy and a gambler. In 1694, at the age of 23, and already famous for his mathematical prowess, he killed a romantic rival in a duel, and his life's course was set. He was convicted of murder and awaiting sentence, but he escaped prison and fled to Holland. On the lam in Europe over the next 10 years, he honed his card playing and odds making skills, which were exceptional, and combined with returns on investments, netted him some 6 million livres tournois. 6 million livres tournois is approximately 1 million pounds sterling in this period, and maybe instead of confusing non-French speakers with livre, I'll just say pounds from now on. If I slip back into livre, forgive me. Excuse me. The year of Law's duel, 1694, the Bank of England was founded through subscription, its royal charter granting it a note-issuing monopoly in return for reducing the crown's crippling debt. See, France wasn't the only place in debt because of these wars. So their primary opponent, England, was suffering the same problem. Quasi-national British banks had been suggested and proposed for many years, but never before attempted. Law quite naturally followed these developments from abroad. While he was in exile, he became acquainted with Dutch and Italian banks that were far older and more sophisticated than anything he had known at home. Fueled by their country's overseas trading companies, whose shares were exchanged like specie on the market, some of these banks' best customers were, guess who? Europe's debt-riddled governments. Law, amassing his millions through gambling in Europe's financial capitals, was circulating among and snookering at the card tables precisely the sorts of bank backers, rich nobles, and merchants who typically underwrote loans to nation states. He became immersed in the methodologies of these banks and in the strategies of their financier class. Oh, that was premature. Hit it with my knuckle. At this time, Law began to formulate his own bank proposals. He read some of his competitors' works, but mostly disparaged them, claiming that he could do better. His first published treatise, Money and Trade Considered with a Proposal for Supplying the Nation with Money in 1705, proposed a land bank to address Scotland's chronic shortage of silver coinage. Proposals for banks based on land value were not new, but Law advanced concepts far ahead of their time. He was the first to clearly define the law of supply and demand for goods in its modern sense. More impressive still, to me, he posited that money itself was subject to this law of supply and demand, insisting that the best way to ensure its stability would be to replace all silver coinage with paper notes, and concluding that an increased money supply would increase employment, production, and trade surpluses. The plan was rejected by his Scottish countrymen, but Law continued to develop his ideas and proposed a modified land bank system for France in 1706, 1707. It was rejected, but it was actually taken seriously by Louis XIV, who continued studying it. I lost the title for this one. but I think it's called Early Flirtation with Paper Money. The one in the upper left, I guess you can see my cursor. The one in the upper left is Déclaration du roi portant que les billets de monnaie au rang courent dans toute l'étendue du royaume. So this is in April 1707, France introduced paper money. They experimented with it. And the second one, Déclaration du roi, is from about 3 years later, 1710, for the suppression, pour la suppression des billets de monnaie, etc. So they flirted with it for about 3 years. The military really hated paper money. They didn't want to be paid in paper money, because if they were in the Caribbean or the Atlantic somewhere, trade, trying to buy food, trying to buy everything they needed, they would probably come up against people who wanted coin and not money printed in France. And this sort of about face, this volte-face, is unfortunately kind of a harbinger of things to come. Meanwhile, back in the Phantom Empire, any Gene Autry fans out there? Am I dating myself?
You're with me. I don't know about anybody else.
Okay. Meanwhile, back in the Phantom Empire, after a decade, Old Mobile had outlived its usefulness. It was not reachable by ocean-going ships. It was too far from the coast to be easily resupplied, and its soil was far less fertile than hoped. The final straw came in 1711, when the whole place flooded disastrously. So a new settlement was built on the site of modern-day Mobile, and it became, for a while, the capital of the Louisiana colony. That's Mobile on its modern site. In 1712, the French crown was still at war with England for about 3 more years, and in debt up to its eyeballs, considering even its shoestring budget for the colony in Louisiana to be too great a burden. It granted a trade monopoly for a company of Louisiana to the king's financial counselor, Antoine Crozat, a wealthy financier of overseas trade who seemed like the perfect fit to energize the pitiful colony. The colonists did enjoy some improvements at the outset of this new regime, but the crown typically reneged on its promise to fund military resources, and the company got stuck with the bills. To offset this, Crozat raised the prices he charged soldiers and settlers for their meager supplies, and he was reviled by them for doing so. In the same year, 1712, Law made his next proposal for the city-state of Turin in Italy, and his theories had evolved. It was not a proposal for a land bank, but for one modeled on the Bank of England, which, with assist from the East India and South Seas companies, had finally successfully managed that country's war-induced debt. Although it was rejected by the Turins, it prefigured his second proposal for France, a national bank which would A, increase the money supply with paper currency, B, convert the country's debt into actionable shares, and C, eliminate the tax farms and their capital immobilizing annuities. Quick explanation. Tax farms are not quite what they sound like, but I think most people know the story of how tax collecting worked in the Middle Ages. The king told vassals X, Y, and Z, I want so much money in tax. I want so much tax from your fiefs. And it was up to the nobles to squeeze the taxes out of the peasants and the middle class, such as it was, any way they could. Any money left over, the nobles got to keep. So there was a version of this system still in place in the early 1700s in France. They sold pensions and annuities. People invested in the government by, instead of paying taxes, sometimes you could buy an annuity. They called them rentes. And the French vocabulary is a little ambiguous. The same word can mean 3 different things in English, but basically meant you were buying some form, you were investing in the government, and the government would pay you back so many percentage points in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years And it was that plus just outright, brutal tax collecting that's how the country got its revenue. What Law recognized very quickly was that annuities were a horrible idea if you were trying to get the country moving, because they locked up a lot of capital that couldn't be spent for years and years and years. Let's see, where was I? So, yes, Law's second proposal to France for a bank in 1712, actually it was in 1715. This plan was in fact favored by Louis XIV, and they were working on it. But on September 1st of that year, he died. His nephew, Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans, we'll just call him the Duke of Orleans, or how about that, the Duke of Orleans. His nephew was not the unanimous choice to be regent for 5-year-old Louis XV, and it took him several months to consolidate power. Once he did, he made some initially welcomed efforts at reform, and people actually thought, wow, after Louis XIV's dictatorship that lasted forever, now we have a reform-minded ruler. How great is that? He encouraged fresh ideas to solve the debt problem. So far, so good. Well, Law seized this opportunity, and with his charm and his impressive command of facts and figures, Law apparently, could do parlor tricks with mathematics. He had a, kind of a photographic memory, and was very fast with math, and could do all sorts of tricks with math and figures to impress people. And he worked his way fully into Philip's confidence, the regent's confidence. And the Regency Council finally accepted his proposal for a bank, but just not the one he wanted. This is one of the documents that the Historic New Orleans Collection is very proud of. It's an original manuscript copy of the letters patent, granting John Law the right to open the Banque Générale in Paris. Little backstory on what that was all about. And you might want to get out your calculators here. The tax farming nobility, remember the tax farmers, the tax farming nobility and the traditional financiers who profited from France's dysfunctional revenue structure were a big force in Parliament, and naturally opposed to any system that promised to eliminate a big chunk of their livelihood. So on May 2nd, 1716, Law was granted letters patent for this bank, a small private note issuing bank, the Banque Générale de Paris. Its startup capital of £6 million, French pounds, was not enough to tackle the national debt, which stood at over £2 billion. But it gave Law the chance to put theory into practice, so he jumped at the chance. The bank sold 1,200 shares at £5,000 each. 3/4 of payment had to be made in billets d'etat, treasury notes into which France's various instruments of floating debt, some £600 million worth, had been devalued to a third of that sum and consolidated the year before in 1715. Billets d'etat. This is another instrument, a little more advanced than the Middle Ages, but they were not very trustworthy, because on a whim the government could devalue them or change the amount of interest it was going to pay on them, and so forth. And that's just how they handled their floating debt, as opposed to their $2 billion in real debt. I don't know. I'm no economist, thank God. I'd be too depressed if I were. So if Law sold all the shares as planned, his bank could at least retire £4.5 million of state debt, which, small potatoes, but it would be a move in the right direction. However, his bank was initially derided and disparaged for its size and its inscrutable business model, which included not charging a fee for exchanging foreign currency. This was unheard of. All banks charge a fee for exchanging foreign currency. Guess what? Most still do. But this and other such perks attracted a lot of wealthy depositors, as did especially Law's guaranteed one-to-one exchange rate in specie for its banknotes, which protected investors from the state's aforementioned unpredictable currency devaluations. Law proved to be a very able banker, and he attracted investors not only from France, but from all over Europe. As his success mounted, the regent, Philip of Orleans, the regent started investing heavily in the bank with his own money, and he started funneling the state's business through Law's bank, which seemed a good way to reduce the debt. He had no other ideas. So when he did this, he not only ensured the bank's success, but he paved the way for the central bank, for the national bank required by Law's system, the bank that Law really wanted. Excuse me a second. Go away, Novocaine. In January of 1717, Crozat, the cheapskate who was running the Louisiana colony, in January of 1717, Crozat, unable to make a profit on Louisiana, renounced his monopoly, but only in return for the French treasury's forgiving him a large portion of his £6.5 million tax bill. But just 3 months later, in March, he proposed a new trading company. And this new trading company looked suspiciously like a combination of the Bank of England and Law's Bank. That's exactly what he took a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put something together and made a new proposal. His company, Crozat's new company, would issue 500 shares worth £1.5 million, also payable in billets d'etat. In other words, you had to use these horrible treasury shares to buy your company shares. That would force people to take those things out of circulation, help reduce the debt. And so his plan was that a bit of France's floating debt could be exchanged for shares in its threadbare Louisiana colony. What a deal. The Regency Council embraced this concept. However, it had neither the money nor the expertise to implement it. So as 1717 dragged on, the council tinkered with Crozat's plan, but realized they couldn't do anything on their own. They finally asked Law to come in. Law was now highly respected for his bank's success and its help with state finances, everything moving in the right direction. In fact, his bank was so successful that at this period, he was the toast of Paris. Things would change later, but at this moment, he was really kind of a rock star because of what he was doing with his little bank. It was the little bank that was outperforming much bigger banks. So they asked Law to buy a large number of shares in Crozat's proposed new company, which was the only way they could fund it. Well, Law had a counter offer. He came up with a different proposal, and it differed from Crozat's in one essential feature. His version would raise not 1.5 million pounds, but 100 million pounds in capital. And in August of that year, 1717, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped an important slide because I can't see half of the title. But this is in March. This is before, right before they asked Law to come in. And already the council had passed a decree saying that you should pay all your taxes, fees, duties, et cetera, with Law's banknotes instead of with coin from now on. That's kind of a telltale sign, isn't it? And then here is the letters patent that created the Company of the West, La Compagnie d'Occident. This was in August, and Law, according to these letters patent, Law and Crozat were co-directors of the company, but in fact, Crozat's name was on the document just to give it credibility. He was a director in name only. So this is August, from September 14th to the 24th, more than 28 million pounds in mother shares were sold. These were called mères, mothers. Share buying was fueled by growing confidence in Law's abilities, by the regents and Law's substantial purchases thereof, by allowing purchase on credit so that you really only had to put up a portion of what you were buying. I think that still goes on nowadays, doesn't it? And not least, by the desire of those who held billets d'etat to unload them. These billets, which we discussed a few minutes ago, were discounted between 60 and 70% on the market. If you had a billet worth 100 livres and you wanted to sell it for cash, you're going to get 30 or 40 livres cash for your investment. So people wanted to unload these things. And investors could buy a 500 a 500 pound mare, mother share, for a third of the value in BA. And it was supposed that if Law ran the company as well as he ran his bank, dividends on shares would far, far outweigh any interest the state paid on the BA, on the treasury notes. So from this point forward, from the end of 1717 on, Law is no longer selling shares in his bank or in France's treasury. He's selling shares in a fever dream called Louisiana, where investors were assured at every level, all the colonists are getting rich quick. So why not invest in that? You also saw a glimpse of this in Brian's intro. This is a splendid piece of propaganda, probably from early 1719, but can't be sure of the date, possibly as late as 1721. That's supposed to be the port of New Orleans, or possibly Mobile. It's vague, but in either case, there are no mountains. There are no alpine retreats. The water's not that blue. And as you can see, the natives are just falling over themselves to trade with the French and to be friends. And it's a fine piece of propaganda, and just kind of a sample of what was going on back in France. This is a broadside. This was something that he posted on a door. Oh, actually, let's go back a bit. That was, yeah. So the Treasury was unable to print the billets d'etat in sufficient quantities at sufficient speed, because so many people wanted, people had these shares on paper, but they didn't actually have the paper documents. They just had a signed contract. So it took the Treasury a while to get going to print these things so they could be traded in for company shares. And it was actually not until December of 1718 that Law's bank reached full capitalization, but it did, 100 million pounds. In spite of this, the company forged ahead with its plans for Louisiana, possibly using Law's personal funds. That's not clear. Already in September of 1717, it had sold land concessions, some near a place dubbed New Orleans on its maps. Whether informed by local tribes, as the story so often goes, or perhaps by the handful of French-Canadian settlers who'd already been living and trading near there for a decade, or both, Bienville had finally found the perfect location from which to control commerce on the Mississippi. An ancient native trading site known as Bulbancha, the place of many languages. It sat on relatively high ground, was easy to defend, and was a short portage to Bayou St. John, and from there to Lake Pontchartrain. And ocean-going ships could reach there by sailing through a pass, known as the recueils, and they could, instead of trying to sail up the Mississippi, which was often impossible, they could come in the back door, and supplies and trade goods could be dealt with there, just a few miles from the city. By May of 1718, Bienville's men were clearing land and building huts on what would become the site of the French Quarter. It was a simple beginning, but one 20 years in the making, and only happening at all thanks to the existence of Law's company, which in its first 16 months alone brought more ships to Louisiana than Crozat's company had in almost 6 years. January 1719 saw the next step in Law's system. His Banque Générale became the Banque Royale. It became the National Bank of France, and it was answerable only to the regent. But by June of this year, 1719, company share prices were lagging, and Law couldn't, his system, he realized that, at heart, his system was a giant Ponzi scheme. That if share prices fell too far, that would be the end of everything. So with share prices lagging, he came up with a new scheme, and he engineered a merger between his Company of the West and the French companies of the Indies, of China, and of Africa. However, as should not be surprising to you, all of these overseas trading companies were in debt as well. But Law had an answer. He had an answer for everything. He raised 75 million pounds in fresh capital by issuing a second and third round of shares in the company in June and July. And this is for his consolidated Compagnie des Indes. The consolidated company was called the Company of the Indies. So the daughters and granddaughters, the filles and petites filles, second and third generation shares, were payable in currency. Instead of buying them with worthless treasury notes, you had to buy them with coin, and could only be bought or and here's the interesting thing too, they could only be bought or resold by holders of the mother shares. So if you were in on the ground floor, then it's kind of like you had the Taylor Swift tickets, and only you could sell them or resell them. Over the next 6 months, as the price of the mother shares rose to almost 50 times their original cost, those most heavily invested in them, including Law, the regent, and their friends and backers at court, saw their wealth increase spectacularly. And to describe these people, the term millionaire was coined. It had never been used before. And it was coined to describe these so-called Mississippians. These investors who got in on the ground floor, these millionaires, were called Mississippians. And in the literature of the period, there's a lot of confusion. They use Louisiana and Mississippi sort of interchangeably sometimes. But obviously, the states didn't quite exist yet. When the company issued further rounds of shares in the fall, buying grew to a frenzy. Law, to ensure adequate liquidity, had since January let the Banque Royale issue several billion pounds in new banknotes. Now, some of this issuance was hidden from Parliament by the regent, and some of it was hidden from the regent by Law. He's the only one that knew actually how much money was in circulation. His self-confident gambler's nature was showing and taking over. In fact, he literally wagered on his system. He made side bets worth hundreds of millions of pounds with British acquaintances and friends that his company would outperform the East India Company. It did not, and he did not win those bets. To prop up his system, Law had flooded France with far more paper currency than the real economy could handle. and inflation was starting to become a real problem. But for the moment, everyone was just seeing bulls in the market. So Law offered in August 1719 to take over the entire national debt. He would take over France's entire national debt on his shoulders. All he asked for in return was control of the tax farms, which were still around, although much lessened. Of course, this would deprive the tax farming nobility of their income, which is what they had always feared and suspected would happen. An edict on December 1st, 1719 replaced most species with banknotes. The next day, company shares peaked at 10,025 pounds. But then they began a slow decline. Some big investors had begun cashing out. On December 30th, a company office was opened in Paris to trade shares at prices fixed by the Banque Royale, the national bank, excuse me. And that steadied the market for a time. On January the 5th of 1720, Law was named Comptroller General of Finances, in effect, the Prime Minister of France. Three days later, shares in his company peaked once again at 10,100 pounds. However, rumors of disease, famine, failed concessions, and, oh, by the way, an insufferable climate, things that were already known to many folks in high places in France, these rumors began reaching the streets of Paris. When the company trading office closed in February, share prices fell yet again, losing almost 20% in 1 week, with investors going bananas and a lot of protests and even a few small riots happening in France from this time for the next couple of months. With all this going on, Law tried one more time to put on the brakes. An edict of March the 5th reopened the share trading office, and Law guaranteed to buy back shares at 9,000 pounds, not their 10,100 pound maximum, but a price he could live with. At the same time, however, Law was trying to deal with his too rapid expansion of the money supply, the paper money supply. And as investor confidence in the company and the colony was fading, well, confidence in the paper money was fading too, and more people were insisting on being paid in coin. But over the previous 2 years, tens of thousands of people with money had traded in their coins for paper money, for Law's banknotes. So now, once again, there was a shortage of coinage in the realm. And in a nutshell, he couldn't do two things at the same time. He couldn't keep the price of the shares inflated, but reduce inflation in the money supply. These two things were just contradictory, and his monetary policies became quixotic and contradictory, which further eroded investor confidence. This is an edict from April 20th. In the spring of 1720, when things are going downhill, and purports to be written by the king, but the king is 10 years old at this time. It's the regent. And it says, oh, my beloved French citizens, it has always been my wish to keep the country's economy going and keep lots of coins out there so the economy will work. And anyway, kind of eats some humble pie and reverses course and says that banks will no longer be allowed to print or furnished with printed paper money that can be exchanged for these silver coins. In other words, hang on to your silver. So that's that edict, yes, of the 20th April. On May 21st, share prices were still falling and inflation was still running rampant. And the regent, not knowing what else to do, probably with Law's advice to some extent, devalued both stock shares and banknotes at the same time. And this caused more public outrage and led to more riots. And there was one, the riots were not large, but a couple of them were very violent. And one of them happened close to the palace. And the regent was in the palace at the time, and it both scared him and upset him, because he took the riots as a personal affront. Like, his people didn't think he was doing a good job as ruler, and that, hurt his feelings. So the riots kind of got to the regent. So that was May 21st, when the shares and banknotes were devalued. Law was fired from his position as the controller of finances a week later, but not long after that, he was recalled by the regent to serve as an advisor. However, he was sort of behind the scenes, probably afraid to show his face on the streets. By mid-August, the Crown decided to gradually retire and burn Law's paper currency. They saw no other solution. Nothing else could be done. Law spent these last 6 months fighting to preserve the system. He tried some hybrid schemes involving traditional sources of revenue, such as bonds and annuities, which he had tried to get rid of in the beginning. And he was able to sell some of these new instruments, but not nearly enough to save his system or to save himself. And here's a couple of examples of his enemies at court. The tax farming folks. Now they're coming back, and these are documents. These are edicts, ordinances, which bring annuities and pensions back into play. A sure sign that, yeah, things are out of control. And it was a little bit after this they gave up and decided to burn Law's paper money. Took them a while to do that too, because there was a lot of it. It was all over the place. By December of 1720, Law was forced to quit France forever. He owned numerous chateaux and houses in Paris and other valuable property, and had bank accounts. And he left all of that behind. He voluntarily gave it up to go toward his debts and the debts he had caused the country. He would die in poverty less than 10 years later in Venice. These last part of my reason for doing this was to plug some of our new acquisitions. These two documents on the screen are from a very recent acquisition earlier this year, as is this one. And they came from a set of 19 documents, which we bought from a dealer in Paris. And 11 of the 19 we cannot find any trace of in the literature. Never before seen. I mean, somebody's seen them, but until we made this purchase, we didn't know they existed, and we couldn't find them in any lists or compendiums, including the most impressive ones. Which brings us to the other recent acquisition that I wanted to plug, the recueil des lettres patentes, edicts, déclarations et arrêts, blah, blah, blah. This was published in 1723, just a little more than 2 years after Law's disgrace, fall from grace, and getting kicked out of France. Two interesting things about it. as far as we know, there are only 2 copies in existence. We now have one of them. And recueil just means a collection in French. This is a compendium of, and you see the table of contents here. There are a couple of hundred of these edicts, ordinances, letters, patent, like the ones we've been looking at. There are a couple of hundred of them listed here. And following the table of contents, well, actually, the table is probably the back of the book, but there are reprints of the entire edict. So, like all the ones I've been showing you on the screen, I'm just showing you the first page. They're typically 4 to 10 pages long, something like that. And they're sort of pamphlet sized. What this book does, it reproduces those things word for word in book form. And in 1723, when Law, when you could probably get into a fight if you mentioned Law's name in a bar. And so who did this and why? That was the mystery. So the answer comes from the John Law expert historian Antoine Murphy, who actually turned us on, if I may use the vernacular, turned us on to this book, to its existence. That as far as the regent was concerned, as far as Philippe of Orleans was concerned, Law's exile was temporary, was intended to be temporary. He planned to bring him back. And the Duke's secretary at the time, Jean-François Mellon, detailed this scheme in his 1734 Essai politique sur le commerce. With the support of the regent, Law planned to reestablish the Company of the Indies, to be its head once more, of course, and to introduce a new credit system confined within safe limits. Yes, Law had spent the intervening couple of 3 years looking at his mistakes, figuring out what he did wrong, and coming up with a new system. This time, of course, he was going to get it right. However, as Mellon, the secretary, writes about the regent, death finished his big plans. He died in December of 1723, and with that, so did Law's comeback. This recueil, published by THNOC, the publisher, this recueil was never circulated. It could have gone into a large printing had things gone differently, but as things turned out, it's like a misprinted stamp. There's 2 of them, and I guess they're worth a lot of money. I would like to end. I don't have a watch with me, but I would like to end with an epilogue and some eye candy. There's the beginning of the eye candy. First, the epilogue. Let's see. Considerable fortunes, a few of them lasting, and the people who pulled out early. Considerable fortunes were made investing in the Mississippi system. Thousands of wealthy and near wealthy families who bought in late and paid most for the shares were hardest hit by the bubble's collapse. Like Law, they gambled big and lost big. But their investments had kept the boom going, allowing France's underperforming economy for about 2.5 years to greatly, greatly expand. The increased money supply and concurrent absorption of state debt had freed up the Regency to do some long overdue housekeeping, including upgrading the Navy's fleets and personnel, which was essential for the survival of France's colonies. As for the Company of the Indies, even Law's enemies realized that its success could help dig the state out from under the bubble's collapse. So it was not abandoned. It was reorganized. It was absolved of the central bank's debt and allowed to retain its fleet. It was allowed to retain all the things, the capital investment that it had created during the bubble. It was also allowed to keep its trade monopoly in Louisiana. And over the next decade, the Company of the Indies would bring thousands of colonists and thousands of enslaved African workers to Louisiana. And that's the end of my talk. I hope the timing's about right.
We're a little over, but we're gonna keep it running. If anybody needs to,
just some quick eye candy.
nope, understood. Okay,
Yeah,
let me just step in just for a second.
Yeah.
If you need to bail, I understand that. We go till 9 o'clock or till the hour. We're a little over. We're gonna let Howard keep going for sure. We got some questions up there too. Let me just remind you that we're here every month, and a certificate of attendance is part of an email that you'll receive when this Zoom webinar closes. Look for it within, a couple hours after we're done here too. But we're gonna let Howard keep going. But if you need to disappear at the top of the hour, certainly understood. But Howard, I'm gonna mute myself and let you keep going here for just a little bit if you can.
Yeah, and this shouldn't take long. So New Orleans was founded in 1718, but it was just a bunch of Quonset huts, really. Couple of buildings were actually made with logs, timber, but they didn't have a lumber mill, so there were no there was no siding. It was pretty primitive, and that's one reason is that there was a fight, a struggle in the French court as to which location would be the capital. Bienville wanted it to be New Orleans for all the important and obvious reasons cited earlier. But some other people wanted to move it back to Biloxi. And Bienville had spent a couple of the worst years of his life in Biloxi. People were really starving when they lived there. The soil was terrible, and it was just not there was no shelter from hurricanes, really. It was a pretty bad place to be living right on the beach, right on the coast. So there was the struggle going on in court. Adrien de Poget and Leblanc de la Tour, Pierre Leblanc de la Tour, were two French military engineers who were sent to build a new capital in Biloxi. And there are there's some drawings of that, really elaborate drawings of what that was going to look like. But when the Mississippi bubble collapsed, it led to a change in the dynamics, and Bienville gained some more power in his arguments, and he won the day. So in 1721, Depoget was actually living in Biloxi, but he came over to the New Orleans site, and Bienville asked him to draw something up, kind of a first sketch. And this is the oldest drawing of what a conception of what the French Quarter would look like, and that's basically what happened. But at the time, in 1721, there were no streets yet. There's nothing like this. So this is a little bit later, 1723. Well, and this is actually the first official plan. This was the first plan which was executed, where they actually started surveying and laying out the streets that would look like this. And what happened was there were enough colonists living in New Orleans who were happy in their Quonset huts and their shacks. And when Depoget came in and said, no, we have to have a rectangular grid and straight streets, and it meant everything was going to have to be demolished. And these colonists said, you're not demolishing my shack. And there were a couple of hundred of them. So the lucky thing that happened was a big hurricane came along, blew everything down, and then they couldn't argue with the engineers anymore. So, okay, we'll lay out the streets the way you want them to. And this is the first rendering that was actually acted on. And this is the Place d'Armes, what today is Jackson Square. This was the parish church, what is today St. Louis Cathedral. And just this is from the same year, but it's kind of fantasy. There were maybe a third as many structures at the time. These were the ones they planned to build in the near future. And of course, the structures are the red squares and rectangles. All the little green things are gardens. Everyone grew as much of their own food as they could. And flowers. They like to grow flowers. I would have been growing food based on everything else going on, but they like to grow a lot of flowers too. And this is a fascinating map, 1728. It's, how did the British Library get it? We don't know. We suspect that this a British ship confiscated this from a French ship that it had taken prisoner. That's the most likely thing. But it's actually it's just full of information. It's the only one of the few realistic plans of the time showing that the city is completely surrounded by cypress swamp. And at the beginning of the colony, if it was easy to build a house, you could just walk a few hundred yards and cut down all the trees you needed, all the cypress trees you needed. And just want to leave you with this. At the top is our website. Everything I showed you on the screen that belongs to us, all those records and images are in our online catalog. And then that's my email address. We all do first name dot second name, first name dot last name. If you have any questions, or you want me to send you links to things, I'd be happy to do it. And for further reading, Marcel Giraud's History of French Louisiana, 5 volumes that took him half his life to write, really incredible work. And then anything by Antoine Murphy, anything he writes on this period is super. He's the real law expert in this domain. I just put some stuff together and read it to you. So,
no, it was great.
Thanks.
So my suggestion is take a screenshot of that so you can reach out to Howard and you'll have a contact info for him. I'm going to reclaim the host here too and kind of wrap us up. And then I'm going to share my screen. Let's do that one. Come on. There we go. And I'm going to wrap us up. We'll be out of here in just a minute or two. Pray from current slide. So things to remember as we move forward. A certificate of attendance. If you're watching this live, you're going to be something in your email. The email will explain that you watched it for this. Put that in. We're not going to send it out to your appraisal organizations, your continuing education organizations. That's up to you to do. I'm sure you'll be able to capture all that. You can watch this webinar anytime. Give me a week to get it up. It'll be posted on the Manuscript Society website. It'll also be on the Manuscript Society's YouTube channel, so you can watch it as many times as you want and go over things again and again. Thanks to our special guest, Howard Margot. It's been delightful. Thanks to the trustees and staff of the Manuscript Society, and especially you for being part of this program too. We got more programs on the way. If there's something you'd like to see or see here and you want to present a program, let me know. If you'd like to be an underwriter of the program, we have ways for you to do that too. Here's what's coming up on September 4th. That's Labor Day. Darwin's Life and Autographs, Evolution of a Collection. That's by Dr. Barton Smith. In October, we're going to have the original Wikipedia. Susan Leahy, who is an Asian art expert, will be talking about that. And on November 6th, we got Ken Glass talking about the inside scoop on book collecting. If you're not a Manuscript Society member, you can join right now at manuscript.org. And we're not going to do questions because we are way over time. Matthew, asked a lot of incredible questions. Matthew, I'm going to ask you to reach out directly to Howard to be able to figure out where we are on that, and he'll be able to answer your questions, I'm sure. Howard, it's been a delightful evening. Thanks for coming on after being to the dentist and fighting through that. It was just great. Final thoughts before we wrap up, sir?
I guess I'll have to become a member.
That's
it would be impolite. It would be impolite not to.
If Howard, I mean, if if Albert hasn't twisted your arm, that I'm sure he will at some point. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all so much. We really appreciate you being part of the night, and we're going to call it an evening and say good night to everybody. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and you all stay safe. Talk to you soon. Thanks again, Howard. It's been just
Thank you, Brian.
terrific. We'll see you.
Thanks.